The story of David and Goliath is one of the most popular stories in the Bible. We hear it starting in Sunday school. And it's undoubtedly one of the greatest incidents in the life of David. It was a contrast of incredible proportions. Anybody who had any sense would have said that the winner of this battle was going to be the reigning champ, not the challenger. That seems to be the way that the majority always thinks. No way a ragtag bunch of revolutionaries can bring England to her knees. A self-educated, Bible-quoting Kentucky hillbilly becoming president of the United States. Get real. Who would have expected that a simple hobbit whose main skills were, as all hobbits, eating and living peacefully, could have saved the world? But that had to have been the thinking of the day for our story. Frightened Israel versus the brutal Philistines. And one writer had this to say about the story. He says, the odd makers would have all laughed. Hands down, Goliath gets the nod. Place your bets on the sure things, folks. The little Bethlehemite scampering up the slope would have looked like a wart on a grizzly's belly. A bee buzzing a behemoth. But who would have ever guessed the outcome? But who hasn't applauded it down inside? It's true. We all love when the underdog wins. Deep inside, in our private chambers of our hearts, there's a loud celebration that breaks out when the favorite bites the dust. That's why we pay big money to see movies like Star Wars or cheer as Katniss Everdeen deliberately defies the Capitol in the Hunger Games. See, I think we might have been secretly cheering for David that day. But also, since this was no movie, putting all of our money on Goliath. See, this incident is more than just one of the great underdog win stories. When you study this even closely, you can gain some valuable insight. And the real giant that day was not the big one in stature, but the one who was completely sold out to God. There are some timeless and usable principles that apply to us when we face giants in our own lives, in our world. But first, let's picture the battle scene. According to 1 Samuel, it's a crucial conflict that takes place in a location with a lot of big names that are very unfamiliar to us. But when you boil it down, you find a place that the fight happened as a vast valley enclosed by hill country on both sides. The thinking is that the Philistines are up on the hill and the Israelites are also along the smaller hills and on the valley floor. So you have both armies, huge in number, like blankets of humanity thrown across the shoulders of the hills. Now the Philistine army had this incredible warrior named Goliath, who paraded across his hilltop, taunting the Israelite soldiers to send out their champion to meet him. Goliath was awesome. Not only was he gigantic, but he appeared to have no vulnerabilities. His armor included a bronze coat of mail that weighed 125 pounds. Goliath, the pride of the Philistine, was not only frightening to look at, his words were merciless and threatening. He would shout out his challenges twice a day, and he did this for 40 days. And where was Israel? The army of Israel, where were they? They were paralyzed in fear in their tents. The morale of the Israelite army was at an all-time low. They were down and they were discouraged. But who could blame them? I mean, honestly, how many of us would have jumped right up and raised our hands and said, I'll fight this giant? See, that brings us to our first principle that we have to learn, that we need to learn. That facing giants can be a discouraging experience for us. Giants are tough. You know, it's easy to say how you would fight a giant when they are centuries and miles away from you. When they're wandering through someone else's backyard. And that's just it. We do. We all face giants of one type or another. There are those moments when it seems like the giants of life just knock us out. When every one of Murphy's laws comes true all at once. We all get knocked down from time to time. It's a fact of life. Some of us know people who are like giants that just intimidate other people. Not because they are big physically or that they are awesome or that they are threatening. It's just that their personality is so strong, their tongue so biting, their position so powerful, or their ability so great that we feel small in their presence. Do you know anyone like that? Somebody in your company, in whose company your tongue gets tied, your mind turns to mush and you feel totally incompetent. Several years ago, maybe almost 20, I had the pleasure to meet President Bill Clinton. He was kicking off his Whistle Stop campaign in Huntington, West Virginia. And when I did some research, 20,000 people were there. I didn't know that. I knew there was a lot of people. I was just a little kid. I was maybe 9 years old. And here I was in this crowd, my mom pushing me through to get to the front. And here was the President of the United States shaking my hand. I was frozen. Terrified. But I guess we all really know what it feels like to be around people who just make us nervous or intimidated. At that moment, standing before the leader of the free world, my little 9-year-old mind couldn't grasp it. It's like I short-circuited. And in these moments, you tend to lose your confidence. You even your poise, and it can be even disheartening to yourself. You start questioning. And there are some giant-like problems that can stand before us as well, and just melt us into a deep discouragement. Maybe you have family problems that are dragging you down. Or maybe you have an illness that's wearing you down, and there seems to be no answers. Or maybe you have financial problems that loom large, and you just don't know how you can overcome that giant stack of mortgage payments or car payments or doctor's bills. Or maybe even it's a certain temptation that looms before you like a Goliath. But we have to remember one important thing, and that is facing the giants in life are tough. But they're also inevitable. In fact, although we should not live in constant fear, wondering what's going to befall us next, we need to be realistic. We need to be grounded in reality. No one is immune to crisis. No one is exempt from heartache and struggle. It comes to us all. Even Christ knew what it was like to get knocked down and to have his life cave in. But he tells us in John 16:33, he says, "Be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." One of the best ways to prepare for trouble is to make sure your expectations are realistic. The writer of 1 Peter said, "Don't be surprised at the painful test you're suffering, as though something unusual were happening to you." But one of the things we learn from David here is to expect from time to time that we're going to have to endure a problem. See, David faced large difficulties of wild animals and rustlers when he was with his sheep. So he wasn't that off balance when it came to face another kind of giant. And he teaches us that the timing of when the giant comes into our life is not nearly as important as how we handle them as they loom over our lives. But how did David handle his giant? Let's see if there's some kind of hint that we can somehow grapple with our own giants. For 40 days, Goliath issued his challenge to the frightened Israelites. But one day, a shepherd boy by the name of David responded with faith rather than fear. How could this kid look at this situation so differently than the seasoned warriors of Israel? The difference was David's perspective on the problem. When he looked at the situation, he didn't see a giant as much as he saw someone defying God. God was real to David, just as Goliath was real to the soldiers. So when he heard and saw this huge Philistine, he couldn't believe that they would just stand there. Why were Saul and his soldiers not furious with the giant? I think it's interesting that Saul could have ultimately done the same thing that David did. Saul was the natural challenger of Goliath. Remember last week when we talked about him, he was by far the biggest man in the kingdom. He was a Benjamite, which had a very particular skill. This tiny tribe was a mere remnant of Israel, but they were also the most skilled of all in the use of the sling against their foe. So without ever engaging in hand-to-hand combat with Goliath, Saul could have tried to kill the giant with a stone, just like David. But he refused. Why? See, Saul had a lack of faith. His lack of faith was his real giant because he trusted in his own understanding, his own rationalization. See, here's David. David volunteered to fight Goliath, this giant taunting the army of Israel. You see, David didn't see the giant as a problem as much as a possibility to show God's glory. And see, confronting giants takes a courageous response. That's our next principle. The normal reaction to a giant is to run away. Our story today tells us when the Israelites saw Goliath, they ran in great fear. And rather than confront a difficult problem, many of us will try to ignore them. Rather than confront a difficult problem, we find ways to escape by using drugs, alcohol, pleasure, or even just sleep. Rather than get the help we need, we just somehow think that it'll go away. We run in fear. But David refused to run. And he asks, who is this heathen Philistine to defy the army of the living God? Now that's courage. This little boy hears this man defying God. And see, it takes courage to confront those giants. It takes courage to confront our fears. And I believe that it's impossible to live a victorious life without David's kind of courage. But the important question is how do we get that kind of courage? How do we overcome the fear of our giants? There are 3 steps that David applied to his own life. And we can get these from the story. First, he rejected human or worldly solutions. In verse 28, his brother Eliab tried to put a guilt trip on him. You remember Eliab. Last week we knew this guy as the guy that Samuel thought should be the next king because of his physical appearance. But here he shows his true colors. He says to David, "What are you doing? What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know your pride. You just want to see the battle." He's jealous. And David just simply ignores him. And then Saul, he takes David aside and tries to equip him with his own armor. He puts on his breastplate, his helmet, and his sword. But Saul was a lot bigger than David. Remember, he was the biggest. So David couldn't even move in Saul's armor. So David just cast it aside and wore his shepherd's guard. Now, when you fight a giant, there will always be people in your life that are going to try to give you solutions to deal with your giant. They'll advise you, go ahead and fight them. Sue him. Dump them. Get a divorce. There's always going to be those who will suggest to you for you to use their armor to lead